In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
We began Advent 3 short weeks ago with the readings pointing us to the second coming of Christ, full of apocalyptic language, uncertainty, and expectation. Over these weeks, we've moved from that future focus to a preparation to remember and celebrate the first coming, that of a baby born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. In 2 out of 3 years, we hear stories that focus on Mary, a young woman, probably no more than 14, who is visited by an angel and told that the child she will bear is of the Holy Spirit, and of her resounding yes to God. We hear of her visiting her older cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. But this year, since we're in Matthew's Gospel, we hear a different side of this story, or a different part of this story. We hear this from the perspective of Joseph, a man who has just learned that his promised bride is pregnant with a child that is not his. In that culture at that time, betrothal was a binding promise of fidelity. The only difference between betrothal and marriage was that the couple did not yet live together, and the penalties for adultery were harsh. Depending on how strictly the laws of Deuteronomy were followed, Mary could have been stoned. More likely, she and her family would have been publicly shamed, and her life would have been in ruins. But back to Joseph. Who was he? Both Matthew and Luke tell us he was descended from David. The reading tells us he was a righteous man. Some of the translations instead call him a just man. The word Matthew used means to live by the Jewish law as it is given in the Torah, as God's revealed word. It means to live in right relationship with God. Kenneth Bailey, in Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, further describes that perspective as someone who follows the law as it is given and applies the same standards consistently to all, without favorites. To a man like that, what a disturbing shock Mary's pregnancy would have been. He must have struggled with this news, perhaps hurt or angry or afraid of what the community would think, or just generally upset. He must have stewed and fumed as he considered what actions to take. Should he follow the law literally and have her stoned? Should he publicly renounce her and shame her and her family? Yet Joseph's notion of justice was compassionate. It wasn't adherence to the strict letter of the law. It was adherence to the strict letter of the law, but it wasn't cruel. He wouldn't move her into his home as his wife, but he wouldn't publicly shame her. Instead, he would just privately, quietly divorce her. Her life would still be in ruins. She would still have a child but no husband. But her humiliation would be less public. She would still be ostracized, perhaps even from her own family, and would have to raise that child on her own. But she wouldn't have to endure the experience of that public divorce. As an aside, in the Magnificat, Mary's song, the line we translate as, "You have regarded the lowliness of your handmaiden," is another one of the places where the translators have tamed things down, where they've made the translation less shocking. More literally, it should read, You have looked upon the humiliation of your slave girl. But I digress. And like Mary, Joseph is visited by a messenger from God. And that messenger, as angels are wont to do, begins by telling Joseph, "Don't be afraid." But this time, instead of saying this because angels know that angels are potentially scary beings for human beings, the angel addresses the fear that might have been part of Joseph's decision. The angel tells him not to be afraid to take Mary as his wife. And then the angel tells him why. This child is of the Holy Spirit. This child is a son to be named Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua, a name that recalls the story of Moses and the Exodus, a name that means God saves. This child will save his people from the many ways they are separated from God by their own actions and brokenness. He will also be called God with us by the people who follow him. Joseph, as a righteous man, followed the instructions of God's messenger, acting in a way that redefined right relationship with God. Joseph, in compassion and kindness, listened and discerned that being righteous might just be about care for the fragile and exhausted, the ones whose future was at risk, rather than following the expectations of the culture or the letter of the law. Joseph, like Mary, said yes to God, living faithfully in a way that was outside the bounds of social convention. Joseph could have said no. He could have closed his eyes and ears to the angel, to God's messenger. He could have decided that he wasn't willing to trust Mary or to raise a child that wasn't biologically his. He could have decided that following the law and social conventions was more important than a risky kindness and safer than trusting the messenger. He could have decided that righteous but not cruel was a good enough solution. What if? How would that have changed the events that followed? Would Mary have survived her pregnancy and the birth of her son? Who would have protected them from Herod? Who would have guided them to Egypt and protected them on the way? Who would have provided a home for them, a safe place for Jesus to grow up? Surely God would have managed things. But how would the story have been different? Joseph was presented with circumstances that looked like personal disaster, and with choices that ran counter to all expectations and social norms. God's instructions ran counter to every expectation Joseph would have had. And in those instructions, God was doing something new and marvelous. Joseph had the chance to be part of it. In Joseph's yes, he not only protected and provided for Mary and her child. Joseph was descended from David. As the angel told him, he named that child Jesus, God saves. By naming the child, the act of naming the child by a man acknowledges the child as that man's son. Through this naming, Jesus was legally brought into the Davidic heritage. Through Joseph and his yes to God, Jesus became son of David. And like the child in Isaiah's response to King Ahaz, Jesus also became Emmanuel, God with us. God with us, God living as a human being among us. The incarnation, connecting the human and the divine. God saves, and God is with us. We need them both at the same time, present in our lives and in our theology. We need both to open our eyes to God's presence in our lives, to fully become God's people, and to work to make present the kingdom of heaven here on earth. Like the circumstances that Joseph encountered, God also presents us with choices, with opportunities to be part of what God is doing in our midst. Like Joseph, we're given the opportunity to discern what God is asking of us and where God is leading us. And like Joseph, we're given choices about how to respond to situations beyond our control and outside our expectations. Situations that ask us whether we're willing to respond in ways that run counter to the ways of the world and the ways of our society. The easy choice is often one of following the letter of the law or the conventions of society, sometimes softening those ways to make them a little less stringent. But it isn't enough to be righteous but not cruel. We know that our choices align with God's plan when they come from the way of love. Just as Joseph chose to take Mary as his wife and to name her son Jesus as a way to bring him into the line of David, we can choose to act in ways that bring others into the family of God. We know that our choices are in line with God's plan when they allow us to actively love someone into the family, as a friend of mine likes to say. So where can we, like Joseph, respond to God's plan with a yes? What actions can we take to bring someone into the household of God? Amen.